Hello, everyone. My name is Jordyn Smith, and I am the voice and the astrologer for this YouTube channel, Nonconformist Conscience. This is the first in the series of going over the houses, sign slash planet as an archetype. I've had a lot of people ask me, I've stated this before, but they're wanting to understand the archetypes within evolutionary astrology more. And so I thought I could do just a little series on the archetypal nature um, of the signs and the houses and the planets. So the first one is for Aries, or the first house and Mars. Something I think that it's really important to distinguish is in other schools of astrology, the house, the natural zodiac, in this case, we're doing the first house, so Aries and the planet Mars, in this case, are all different things. Within evolutionary astrology, which is what I practice, it's all the same archetype. And I find this really profound because it is when you look at it this way, it's easier to synthesize. The distinguishing factor would be if there's a planet in a house, let's say in the first house, you're going to take the house first. So let's say you've got a Pluto in the first house in Scorpio. Well, that Pluto is going to act more like a Pluto in Aries because the natural ruler of the first house is the sign of Aries. And then that Pluto being in Scorpio in the first house, well, that Pluto in the first house is going to feel like Aries, but then it's going to be conditioned by Scorpio. And so you'll see that and um, you'll look at a chart in that way is the house first, then the sign that's conditioning it, and then the facilitator, the planet that rules that other planet. Um, So I wanted to make that distinguishing factor. And as we go along in this series, you'll get more of a feel of what I'm talking about. So the way that I'm going to structure this is I'm just going to go over the house, the sign, and that planet, and the archetypal nature of it. And then I'm going to show you a chart example, and then I will go over some of the transits that can happen within that house, what that's speaking to in a very general sense. That way, you all can start to get a feel. Archetypes are vast, they are wide, but once you start to have a foundation of what an archetype is, and if you're someone who is wanting to understand your own chart or wanting to start doing chart readings, the more and more you practice, um, the more and more the archetype will reveal itself to you. That's because astrology is a science of observation and correlation. And so I find that when someone is talking to me, and I'm looking at their chart starts to speak to me through the nature of the words. So I'm able to observe and to correlate through what that person is saying. And so just having a good foundation of the archetypes is really, really important. So with the first house, Aries, Mars, what you're looking at is this is a cardinal archetype. In the cardinal archetype, the cardinal signs, of course, are Aries, Cancer, Libra, and Capricorn. But as a general rule, in the cardinal archetype, it's initiatory, no matter what house it or sign it's playing out, as long as it's cardinal, you're seeing that something has just come to a close, evolutionary speaking, and something is now wanting to be initiated or it has just been initiated in a recent prior lifetime. And the way that you would understand that is, again, through observation and correlation. But in the first house, Aries, Mars is something is wanting to be initiated and it is speaking to desires, what the soul is desiring. Mars and Aries in the first house all speaks to the desires that are conscious within the soul. Whereas Pluto is more about subconscious desires on a soul level. Aries, Mars, and the first house are things that are conscious, that get seeded into our consciousness. And whenever you are wanting to evolve and to grow, the ways in which you grow and evolve is through initiating a sequence of desires. And through those desires, you receive feedback. That's why Aries and the first house and Mars speak to creating action and choice making. So through me desiring something, I am going to then, if I'm naturally expressing Aries, um, or the first house, Mars, I'm going to be being responsible within, is this something that I truly want to act upon? And then I have to make a responsible choice. That is seen through the square from Capricorn to Aries. And so there are some desires that we are meant to act on and some that we're not. Some desires that we have are long-standing desires that we haven't been able to act upon, and some of them are desires that are known and familiar that we continuously act upon. And so it teaches us about our choice making and how to be responsible. Through the action that we choose to make, we then receive a feedback. And from that feedback, we then get to learn, and that is how we evolve. And eventually, our desires um, are eliminated. And we eventually go from temporal desires to more spiritual desires along our evolutionary path. And you can think of Aries, Mars, and the first house as a kind of a self-cleansing oven for Pluto or the soul. As we act on things and we eliminate those desires, um, there's no need for them. And so a new desire can become seated within our consciousness in order for us to then make the choice to act on it and to grow and evolve more from that feedback that we learn. Um, so it's really, really important to understand the archetype of Aries, the first house, and Mars. The other dynamic is that this archetype is really based on our instinctual nature, our primal nature, the thing that is really connected to our soul. Whenever we are not conditioned, or there's a lot of deconditioning going on, we are able to then access our instinctual nature a lot more easily. If we have a lot of conditioning, that can be where we're suppressing our desires because we might be feeling like something is wrong with us for acting on those desires or for even having them. And I want to speak to this in a way that you can understand when something is naturally occurring and it's not a distortion of natural law. It is not something to feel like you need to suppress. And so much of Aries, the first house, and Mars is correlating with also our sexual desires. Um, we all have sexual desires. They are intrinsic to our human experience. And whereas Venus is more about our values, Aries, Mars, first house is about the desires on an instinctual, desire-based level. And so then we have to be responsible with our choices around acting on our sexual desires. If you're a person who's not being responsible and is just acting on sexual desires because you have a desire to have a lot of sex with different people, because maybe, let's hypothetically, you feel like that is where you're getting power from, or you're getting your worth from. Well, there can be lessons along the way that help you dissolve those desires because you start to learn that your power comes from within you. And so that desire will eventually fall off and it won't be there anymore. But there's this need to be responsible because whenever we're not, that can be where we end up creating harm for ourselves and for others. Um, Something that I really want to speak to whenever it's coming to this dynamic of Aries, the first house, and Mars is that when you look in the natural zodiac, um, Virgo is 5 houses away from Aries, and Virgo is all about improving and purging. And Aries, the first house, and Mars is as we act on our instincts and we make a choice and we create an action. The opposition to Libra or the seventh house gives us feedback through our relationships, Libra. And from that feedback, that first house, 5 signs away from Virgo, or the sixth house, it's called an inconjunct. From that feedback, from that action, first house, the feedback in the seventh, through the inconjunct from the sixth to the first, it helps us to improve upon these functions of our desires. It helps us to assimilate the information that we receive from the feedback. And it helps us to purge old dynamics that we're no longer needing to act upon. And it also teaches us more about ourselves and how we operate on an instinctual level and on an intrinsic soul level. Um, First house, Mars, Aries can also induce fear because it's a separating type of energy. It's masculine or yang energy. There's something that's being separated from. And whenever we are acting on a desire, especially if it's new and it's meant for us to help us grow and evolve, it can induce a lot of fear because it's unknown. And it feels like we're separating from something from the past. And the fear comes not just from it being new, but it's also what feels comfortable is known and familiar. And so oftentimes we don't act on our desires because of the fear of the unknown of if I do this, this is going to propel me into a new area of growth. And that can be a bit uncomfortable. And so this goes back to the cardinal archetype, especially within the first house in Aries and Mars, is that it can be 2 steps forward. We initiate something, we do a little bit in that area, and then it's 1 step back. This is starting to feel really uncomfortable because it's new. I just initiated something. And so I want to take a step back and I want to go back into the territory that is known and familiar because it feels safe and secure, even if it might not be. That's why it takes us so long to evolve, is because we can really start to go back to the past instead of continuing to move forwards through this initiation. And sometimes that 1 step back is because we're needing to improve upon something that we just found out. And so it kind of pumps the brakes a little bit before we can figure it out. And then we can start to initiate more things going in that same direction. Aries, first house, Mars, naturally expressed. It's very much rooted in autonomy, independence, and freedom, needing the freedom to have experiences in order to understand oneself, especially one's own desires. Um, and if it is thwarted, a lot of anger can occur. Mars, Aries first house, can correlate and correspond with anger. Oftentimes, the anger is coming from feeling like someone is impeding upon freedom or independence or your own autonomy. Other times, anger can come from whenever we are suppressing our desires out of fear of being judged. And so there's a lot that can be sussed out within this archetype around our desires in general or our sexuality. And so it's really important to understand these core archetypes. And then whenever you're looking at a chart and you know about someone's life, or you're having a client come to you, you can really start to understand if there's anger or if there is repression of desires. All types of dynamics can arise. And I will explain this further as we look at a chart example in a minute. But the other thing is that, as you know, the first house is the ascendant. It is subject to how others view you. It's your instinctual nature. And because it's instinctual, um, you don't really know that you're coming across that way, right? You could feel very different than what your ascendant is corresponding to, because it's usually other people's perception of how they're viewing you. I will give an example. For me, I have Taurus rising. It's on my ascendant. Um, Growing up, I was told by different people, oh my gosh, you're so strong, you're a survivor. Well, Taurus corresponds with survival and being strong. Um, but inwardly, I did not feel that way. That's how I came across. The other dynamic I experienced is a lot of people would talk about my appearance, which is very Taurus, and how they experienced my appearance was not necessarily how I was feeling about myself. And that's speaking to the totality of my own chart. But um, the reason why I'm giving this is it's just a lot of times people with their ascendant, um, they might not necessarily feel the way that their ascendant, like if you read something in a book and it says that this is how this person is, that might not really resonate with you, because that's really someone else's subjective experience of your instinctual nature. What your ascendant is correlating to is initiating a new cycle dealing with that sign that is on that ascendant on the first house cusp. It's speaking to initiating a cycle of where you're dealing with that dynamic, and then you would look at the ruler of your ascendant to give you more information about that. So for me, I have, like I said, Taurus on my ascendant. And this lifetime, I am initiating and acting on my desires to understand my inner relationship to self, Taurus, and to act on desires in order to understand my values, my personal values, Taurus, what I need, and how to be self-reliant. And I have had a lot of experiences of not being self-reliant, of having self-esteem issues, of not really knowing how to survive, or having survival issues where I had to learn how to survive through different dynamics. Um, and you can look at the ruler of that. My Venus rules my ascendant. It's in Sagittarius in the eighth house. So through initiating this cycle of understanding my self-esteem and how to survive, and my values and my needs, and improving upon my inner relationship to self, I'm doing that through Venus in the eighth house, confronting and getting to the bottom of where I've overcompensated, Sagittarius in the past, where I am confronting old beliefs, Sag, and understanding my personal truths that are correlating to what I actually value, so I can live authentically and improve upon my inner relationship to self and my self-worth. So like that's even not even looking at my whole chart, but just giving you a snapshot of that. It's also having me initiate dynamics of discovering my sexual values through understanding my personal truths. These are dynamics just me personally I've dealt with Taurus being on my ascendant. So you can see how that sign on your ascendant is corresponding to your actual desires. And then you would funnel in its ruler, the aspects that it makes, and then you would want to look at where Aries is in the chart. Mine's on my 12th house. And I would want to look at where Mars is in my chart by house and sign and its aspects it's making. Well, my Mars is in the 12th house as well. And it's in Aries. And guess what? It trines my Venus and it squares my Mercury and my ninth in Capricorn. So for me, not only have I had desires to initiate understanding my inner relationship to self, but I've been doing this through, yes, that Venus function in the eighth house that I just talked about, but that's trining my Mars in the 12th. Aries is on my 12th. I've had desires to dissolve my own idealistic expectations and to cultivate a spiritual relationship in order to change the way in which I inwardly relate to myself. That's part of Taurus being on my first house, my ascendant, is I'm wanting to initiate how to change how I inwardly relate to myself through dissolving all types of dynamics where I have um, gotten into relationships where I projected idealistic expectations with others, and I had to experience abandonment and misuse of trust. Venus in the eighth, trining that Mars in the 12th, and how it's been disillusioning. And through the square to Mercury from my Mars, I've been learning how to have a personal voice of authority. I've had desires to be my own authority in order to understand my inner relationship to self. So you can see how it all starts to fit together. Um, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to share a chart with you that's not mine, so you can really see how this is working out, and I'll annotate it and we can go over it. And then I'll pull the chart down and I'll speak about just some of the transits in a general sense of when they're going through that first house, what that can correlate to. So this is Lady Gaga's chart, and Lady Gaga is a singer, songwriter, and actress, as you all know. And she she was born in New York. She was born to um, parents who uh, are Italian and were Roman Catholic. She went to an all-girls Roman Catholic school. She said that she was really studious, that she um, had a drive to learn, but that she was a bit insecure. But she also wanted to express herself in a more provocative way. At 4 years old, she started to learn how to play the piano, and she calls herself very versatile and adaptable, and that she has really felt strong desires to be versatile and adaptable to continue to grow. She also experienced sexual assault at the age of 19 by a producer, and that created a lot of post-traumatic stress for her, that she utilized music and her own expression to be able to heal that dynamic. And she is a philanthropist. She started the Born This Way Foundation, which is really about youth empowerment, and she is really huge with LGBTQ advocacy. As a matter of fact, she wouldn't answer questions during an interview around whether or not she had a penis. And it was last year where she actually expressed and vocalized why she didn't do that. And it was because she felt that she understood how most of her fan base was LGBTQ, and there were a lot of trans people. And if she were to give an answer about that, how that could actually be detrimental and induce guilt for others around these dynamics, and how she felt like it shouldn't even matter whether or not she was trans, because that's not what she was there for. She was there to express herself through her music, and she didn't want to induce guilt by being offended by that question. So how she dealt with it was she was just like, why does that even matter? Because she wanted to make sure that people felt that she was rooted in inclusion. And so this really speaks to a lot in her chart. So let's dive into just the foundations of the first house. So the ascendant, Mars, and where Aries is in her chart. Because I am rooted in evolutionary astrology, before I do this, I am going to speak a little bit about her Pluto. Um, and then we'll just filter in the archetype of Aries first house and Mars into her chart and stick with that. So her Pluto is in the fifth house in Scorpio, and it's retrograde. It's in a new phase conjunction to the South Node, and the moon is in a new phase to both Pluto and the South Node. Again, all in Scorpio and all in the fifth house. Pluto in the fifth house is someone who is self-actualizing through the strength of their own will, or is meant to. It's also someone who has something that they have creatively actualized that is established from prior lifetimes. There's something unique that they are meant to bring forth that has been already creatively actualized. When you have Pluto on the South Node, this can be where three dynamics can happen. You can either relive in totality a whole prior life dynamic, or you can, through your own prior life efforts of actualizing your Pluto, you can be coming into fruition. And then it's also the third dynamic is where you could be reliving prior life dynamics that you're still needing to work on, and also um, experiencing fruition from prior life efforts as well. And that's really more of an observation correlation dynamic. And for her, the nature of being sexually assaulted is a relive for her. Seen with Pluto and Scorpio, retrograde, conjunct that South Node. Um, it's also sextiling that Mars um, in the seventh house and Capricorn, but also just how she was able to have fruition with her own talents and her own efforts. Something that I want to say is that this is a soul who absolutely um, is rooted in giving, sharing, and inclusion. This Libra is conditioning her South Node, her Pluto, and her Moon. And this is someone who has been confronting and getting to the bottom of um, exercising her own will and her own creative abilities, even through prior life efforts. So it's good to keep this in mind. Just as a bottom line dynamic. So let's get into her ascendant, first house, Mars, and where Aries at. So her ascendant is Gemini, and it is ruled by her Mercury retrograde in the 10th and Pisces. So let's just talk about this. Gemini on the ascendant for this soul is she is, been initiating through her desires a new way of expressing herself and what it is that she's wanting to learn about through taking in information. With her Mercury ruling this and retrograde in the 10th house, this is actually where she's throwing off old information that could be, it's Mercury in the 10th house that's been suppressive in nature. What she's doing now is she's reliving and re-experiencing dynamics of where she is having to get into her pure emotion. Pisces, Mercury in Pisces, as a way for her to act on the desires to self-express in a way that is honest. And it's also where she's finding her own personal voice of authority through doing this. That's Mercury in the 10th house. Um, and so this is where we see she was able to, at 4 years old, start playing the piano. Gemini and Mercury correspond with hands. It's also the ways in which you express yourself. We can see that her Mercury in the 10th house is in Pisces. Pisces has a dynamic with the arts. So does Pluto in the 5th house in this chart. She is tapping into this ability to speak truth within social structures through expressing herself, through singing and acting and her songwriting. Writing is Gemini and Mercury. So you can see that these are the desires that she is initiating, that she has been initiating, and she's having to relive this in order to have certain dynamics come to fruition, and then for her to resolve other dynamics. The other thing I want to point out is Aries is on the 11th house cusp, and it's ruled by her Mars and Capricorn in the 7th, which is also balsamic to this Neptune. Neptune rules Mercury. Um, for her, Aries on the 11th house cusp is about the need for her to liberate from, well, it's about her needing to act upon her desires to liberate from uh, other authority figures, Mars ruling that in Capricorn, and the need for her to dissolve these dynamics of where she was giving her personal voice of authority over to other authority figures. And so for her, it's about recovering her voice in order to establish a personal voice of authority in the social sphere. And in order to restructure her consciousness, that's Mars Neptune conjunction, through her voice, Neptune ruling that Mercury, her chart ruler. And it's based on her structuring her life around values that are rooted in giving, sharing, and inclusion. And so she's truly liberating from and having these desires to liberate from where she suppressed her voice, where she has become disillusioned by that dynamic, and where she didn't view herself as an equal, the 7th house. It's interesting to note that Venus is in Aries, ruled by that Mars in the 11th house. This is where she understands that her work has a more purpose than just her being famous. She's doing it for her fans, and so she's giving it in an inclusive way, 11th house, and sharing herself, her inner relationship to self with others, and valuing them. And she's doing this in a way that's actually helping humanity. This is also where she's had these desires to act on humanitarian and philanthropic levels, using her platform and her voice to speak about injustices that have occurred through the LGBTQ community. Um, it's interesting because her Mars is ruled by her Saturn retrograde in Sagittarius in the 6th house. So she's been having to improve upon her own beliefs and to really recover her authentic nature in order to come out into society with a personal voice of authority that is rooted in her um, authenticity. And it's also rooted in timeless truths, Jupiter and Pisces, where it's rooted in giving, sharing, and inclusion, viewing others as equal. So you can see how she has really utilized this to act on these desires, to be her own authority, to emotionally mature, and utilizing the strength of her own will to have a special destiny and focus that doesn't just include herself, but includes helping others. And that's part of the energy in the sixth house, but also the 11th house polarity of this Pluto, moon, and south node is she's wanting to give it away. Um, so I wanted to just, yeah, speak about this. Um, I don't want to make this series be super long because I don't want to inundate with too much information. But when you're working with this and you're just wanting to understand the archetype of, you know, in this instance, the first house, the ascendant, Mars, and Aries. If you are a student of evolutionary astrology, totally look at the Pluto paradigm and then bring in that archetype and layer it with the other archetypes. You can also see like that Mars sextiling her Pluto, that was retrograde, that there was sexual violence. And it was through an authority figure, Mars in Capricorn, and how that was disillusioning for her. Neptune, Mars conjunct. And that Saturn and Sag retrograde ruling that Mars speaks to how that was a relive as well. And how she was actually utilizing that reliving of that experience to improve upon what actually felt true for her because of how that induced shame and guilt through being sexually assaulted. And that's where I want to say is whenever you are seeing retrogrades and they're corresponding to some type of traumatic dynamic, um, it's not because someone necessarily did that to someone in a prior lifetime. I've said this before, I will say it again and again. We only evolve through our emotional body and through healing dynamics. And so you can see that she was actually able to, it was fated. She relived that experience of sexual trauma in order to recover her truth. Jupiter and Pisces in the 10th, ruling that Saturn and Sag retrograde, which is the ruler of that Mars. Through the sexual assault, she was able to improve upon her own personal truths. And then through Jupiter and Pisces in the 10th, conjunct that Mercury retrograde, she was able to heal this dynamic through then understanding the truth about her being her own authority and not giving that over to others. So these are the things that she desired to do. And then she utilized that as a catalyst to help others, to be of service, Saturn and the sixth, and then to also connect through that truth through her music, as a way to tap into the collective unconscious in order to help people feel connected. So that's the way you can look at that. So if we're wanting to talk about transits through the first house, you need to remember that that's something that can be being initiated, and it's all going to filter into your bottom line dynamic. So if you have Mars that's transiting your first house, you want to look at what it's aspecting in your chart to really understand this. But in a general sense, this is where you can be initiating new desires around um, the need to create action in order for you to evolve. It can also be where you're working on your anger. There's desires to work on your anger. Anger could be coming up. It's also where all of a sudden you could be having people be attracted to you or becoming attracted to people, and that's really corresponding to teaching you about how to act on your instincts, whether or not this is something that is meant to be acted upon or not. Mercury and the first house through transit can be initiating new types of a new cycle of expression or taking in information, where you're wanting to act on desires about learning something new or expressing something in a different way. Again, it really involves your bottom line dynamics in your chart. This can be where you're needing to improve upon your mental constructs and the ways in which you classify or take in information. It can actually speed up. It can be a time of where you're wanting to speed up the intake of information because you're wanting to learn a lot more and you have desires to. Um, it can also be a time where there are desires that you're needing to initiate something with siblings or people in close proximity to you, like your neighbors. Mercury correlates to that. If you have a transit of Venus in your first house, this can be where you're wanting to initiate a new cycle of inwardly relating or of new relational dynamics with others. And so through that action, you're receiving feedback that can help you learn about how you relate to yourself and how you relate to other people. It's also can be where you're initiating a new cycle around your values and understanding what you need in a different way. Um, Jupiter in the first house can be through a transit where um, you're wanting to initiate a new cycle of uh, possibly higher learning, higher education, or wanting to understand, act on the desires of understanding your beliefs, or wanting to initiate a cycle of understanding what are your personal truths. It can initiate where you're needing to be confronted with if you've been overcompensating for something, or if you've been living authentically, or if you haven't. It can magnify this dynamic. It can also be where you have windfalls, depending on what uh, what sign that Jupiter is corresponding to and what aspects it's making in your chart. This can also be where you're wanting to initiate understanding uh, some type of new philosophical cosmological system in order for you to understand the nature of beliefs. It can be where you get confronted by other people's beliefs, and in return, that's helping you to understand what your own beliefs are versus truths. Um, it can be where you're needing to uh, align yourself with things that feel more authentic and honest for yourself. If you have Saturn transiting your first house, this can be where you're initiating a new cycle of um, working on how you've structured your life. And you're needing to act on desires to figure out how you want to restructure your life. This can also be dealing with career or family. There can be anger that all of a sudden is coming up around family or things within your career field. It can be where all of a sudden you're wanting to initiate a new career or a new way of um, getting in touch with your conditioning. It can also be where you're acting on desires of needing to look at what you've suppressed, or if you've been in oppressive environments and you're dealing with the anger of that. And so you're needing to really get in touch. And it can be where you're initiating a new cycle of needing to self-reflect. Saturn correlates to that, where you also are needing to look at the nature of your judgments and the guilt that you feel or the shame that you feel. And or it can be initiating a cycle of where you're needing to understand how to be your own authority or to emotionally mature, all Saturn things. Um, Uranus can be where you are initiating a new cycle of wanting to individuate, wanting to throw off the past, wanting to liberate from the known, wanting to experience freedom from the known, where all of a sudden you're having to objectify, what do I actually think? Is this what I think? And then needing to liberate from whether or not you have over-identified with the conditioning. It's also where you could feel like growth is occurring very fast. It's also where all of a sudden something in an instance can happen. It can be where you're designed to look at and objectify all different types of facets in your life, even dealing with trauma, since Uranus corresponds with trauma. If there's been any type of suppression, this can be where you're initiating a cycle of needing to objectify um, how your trauma corresponds to what you project and the choices that you make in life. And if something needs to be liberated from so you don't keep repeating it. Um, then if you have Neptune transiting your first house, this can be where you're initiating and needing to act on the desires of um, having a vision, or where you're coming face to face with the nature of your desires and whether or not they're delusional or if they're illusions, or if you can really have a dream and initiate it and access it and get after it. It's where one can be initiating a whole cycle of dissolving different idealistic dynamics rooted in beliefs that have become distortions. It's where one can also feel like they're initiating a cycle of where they feel like they can really spiritualize and grow and be connected, where they're tapping more into universal and timeless truths, and wanting to discover that. Um, and then with Pluto, that is, well, let me go back. Neptune can also in that first house where you're culminating a lot of long-standing desires in order for new desires to be birthed from your consciousness. It's where you could be initiating a change in your consciousness because Neptune deals with consciousness. Pluto in the first house through transit is definitely where you are confronting your desires. You're looking at what it feels instinctual, learning how to act upon your instincts, the psychological and emotional dynamics that go along with that. It's also where you're having to confront your own anger, what you're attracting, what you're not attracting, and really learning about how to be more responsible with making choices around what you desire. But as a baseline, Pluto in the first is definitely going to be teaching you about your instincts on a soul level, initiating a new evolutionary cycle around the desires emanating from within you, needing to understand your own uh, independence and freedom, whether or not something is meant to be acted upon or not. It's about learning the quality of the duration of relationships that you have, that it's not about the duration, it's more about the quality of the time that's spent, what it's teaching you through that feedback. It's where you're also, you could be really dealing and unearthing a lot of suppressed anger. And that can be seen where you feel like someone's thwarting um, your need for freedom. And it can also be where you're initiating a cycle where you're needing to learn how to be independent and free. So I hope that this video helps you understand the archetypal nature of the first house, Aries, Mars archetype, and how it can be funneled into a chart. I didn't even go over all of Lady Gaga's chart because I wanted to keep it simplified for you guys just to see those correlations. Um, but yeah, I will be going through each one of the archetypes throughout the next 12 weeks, and I hope you enjoy. Again, if you have a question or, something comes up, definitely uh, ask it um, in the comments. I love interacting with you all. Um, so anyway, this is just a short version of this. So I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you the next one will come out next Monday, and we'll be going over the second house, Taurus and Venus. So until then, bye.